Do you ever wonder what kind of adults we'd have today if children still grew up without screens? I'm talking about a time before TikTok tantrums and toddler iPads, back when the biggest screen in a kid's life was a clunky TV that clicked when you turned the knob. Growing up in the 70s meant something radically different. It meant freedom. It meant riding your bike until the streetlights came on, learning emotional resilience the hard way, and having actual face-to-face conversations without filters, edits, or emojis. Now here's the crazy part. While today's digital generation is overstimulated and underprepared, the pre-digital generation, the kids of the 70s, developed emotional depth, mental clarity, and a kind of raw resilience that feels almost extinct today. The psychology of 70s kids reveals truths modern parents might not want to hear. And that's not nostalgia talking, that's neuroscience. So why were these kids so different? What made their screen-free childhood a blueprint for emotional strength? And what can we learn from life without the internet before it's too late? We're diving deep into the untold psychology of kids before technology, why they turned out the way they did, how their 70s parenting style shaped their minds, and what today's kids are dangerously missing out on. Whether you grew up in that era or you're raising kids today, this isn't just a trip down memory lane, it's a wake-up call. Stick with me. You're about to see childhood through a whole new lens. Freedom and independence in a screen-free childhood. Back in the 70s, kids didn't text their friends to ask if they could come out. They just showed up. And that freedom? It was everything. The streets were the playground, the bikes were the Uber, and a scraped knee was just part of the day. Parents weren't hovering. They trusted their kids to explore, fall, and figure things out. This kind of unsupervised freedom created something we rarely talk about today: real, lived independence. This wasn't just about physical freedom. It was mental, emotional, even spiritual. Kids learned to make decisions on their own, handle boredom, and self-regulate emotions without being glued to a screen for distraction. When a 70s kid had a problem, they didn't ask Google. They problem-solved, asked around, or learned by doing. That kind of self-reliance built grit, something today's tech-fed childhood often lacks. Growing up in the 70s wasn't cushioned, and that's exactly why it worked. Compare that with kids today, overprotected, overstimulated, and often underdeveloped emotionally. A screen now fills every moment that used to be silent, curious, or even uncomfortable. But discomfort? That's where growth happens. And when we remove every bump, we rob children of the chance to build resilience in older generations. The truth is, freedom taught kids how to be human. And that lesson leads us right into something deeper: how parenting styles back then shaped the emotional intelligence of a whole generation. The 1970s parenting style and its psychological impact. Parents in the 70s weren't obsessed with gentle parenting books or tracking every developmental milestone on an app. They had one core principle: you'll learn when life teaches you. And it worked. That old-school parenting might seem rough around the edges now, but it gave kids something crucial: emotional stamina. There was no helicoptering, no endless negotiating. If you messed up, you faced the consequences. Simple, effective, real. This doesn't mean parents didn't care. Quite the opposite. They believed in raising independent kids in the 1970s, not dependent ones. A mom might show you how to make a sandwich once, but after that, it was your job. Dads weren't running bedtime routines off a parenting blog. They were modeling responsibility through action. Kids learned by watching, doing, failing, and trying again. That kind of organic learning shaped a generation with stronger problem-solving skills, fewer anxieties, and a deeper sense of personal accountability. And here's where it gets fascinating. The psychology of 70s kids shows us that boundaries weren't barriers, they were building blocks. When a child knows where the line is, they feel safer to explore everything around it. Today, with endless choice and little structure, many kids feel lost in the noise. But those who were raised in a world with firm limits and freedom within them, they developed a sense of self most modern kids are still searching for. And that brings us to something just as important: the emotional depth that came from a life unplugged. Emotional development without distractions. One of the biggest psychological differences between kids today versus 70s kids: the ability to sit with emotion without reaching for a screen. A 70s kid didn't scroll away boredom, sadness, or awkwardness. They sat in it. They lived in it. And that experience, uncomfortable as it was, became the foundation of real emotional development. No dopamine loops, no TikTok therapy, just real life, raw and unfiltered. A child back then might have felt lonely after school, but instead of texting a friend or watching YouTube, they daydreamed, journaled, or went outside to find someone to talk to. That process built emotional intelligence the slow, meaningful way. They learned how to name their feelings, cope with them, and move forward. It wasn't always perfect, but it was honest. And that kind of honest emotional work laid down deep roots that many kids today, lost in the noise of notifications, simply never grow. We've traded emotional muscle for emotional numbing. Instant entertainment has made it harder for kids to self-soothe, reflect, or sit in silence. But silence, true silence, was once the birthplace of creativity, inner strength, and even resilience. Mental health before screens wasn't about mindfulness apps. It was about life itself being the teacher. And if that's true, it makes us wonder, what other invisible tools were these kids building back then, just by living screen-free? Well, let's talk about boredom, the lost superpower of childhood. Here's something wild. Boredom used to be a gift. In the 70s, when a kid was bored, they didn't have an app to fix it. They had to get creative. That meant building forts out of couch cushions, inventing games with pebbles and sticks, or turning cardboard boxes into rocket ships. The lack of instant gratification sparked imagination. It wasn't just play, it was brain training. And that's a big part of why the pre-digital generation grew up thinking differently. Boredom wasn't avoided, it was endured. And through that endurance came problem solving, persistence, and innovation. A child who had to figure out how to entertain themselves for hours became a young adult who could solve problems without waiting to be told how. That kind of screen-free childhood wired the brain for initiative and exploration. And here's the kicker. Psychologists now say boredom is essential for the development of a strong inner world. In other words, life without internet gave kids the space to become thinkers, dreamers, and doers. Today, kids are rarely bored, but also rarely original. Their ideas often come from what they've just watched, not what they've imagined. The creative muscle atrophies when it's never used. But those 70s kids, they grew up learning that boredom was just the beginning of discovery. And once you understand that, you begin to see how this era of growing up without screens shaped not just minds, but identities. Which brings us to a deeper layer, how all of this built a quiet but powerful resilience. You know what's missing in a lot of kids today? That quiet toughness, the kind that doesn't need applause or likes to feel real. In the 70s, resilience in older generations wasn't a buzzword. It was a way of life. You didn't post your struggles, you just got through them. From getting picked last in gym class to dealing with real-world consequences, kids before technology learned how to bounce back without being bubble-wrapped from every challenge. Think about it. There were no safe spaces for feelings, no mood trackers, no dopamine hits on demand. Yet somehow these kids developed strong identities. They weren't curated, they were lived. Their self-worth wasn't built around followers. It came from doing hard things, failing, and trying again. Whether it was getting a job at 14, mowing lawns for extra cash, or navigating teenage drama without a digital safety net, they learned who they were by living life head-on. That's something growing up in the 70s gave you, a thick skin and a strong spine. And here's the truth that stings. The digital age impact on kids has softened some of that edge, not by accident, but by design. Algorithms don't reward patience, introspection, or delayed gratification. But the kids from the nostalgic childhood era, they were built different, because life demanded it. And now, as we compare generations, we're left with one burning question. Can we bring back the best of that old-school toughness without abandoning the progress we've made? That's where everything we've uncovered starts to come full circle. So here we are looking back, not just with nostalgia, but with clarity. We've uncovered how the kids who grew up without screens developed independence, emotional depth, creativity, and real resilience. Not because life was easier, but because it was harder in all the right ways. Their world didn't protect them from discomfort. it taught them through it. And maybe that's the hidden secret to building strong, grounded, emotionally intelligent humans today. Now, the big question is, what can we actually do with this knowledge? If you're a parent, how can you bring a bit of that 1970s parenting style into your own home without going off the grid? Maybe it starts by letting your child get bored, or by setting firmer boundaries without guilt, or even just turning the Wi-Fi off for a few hours and watching what happens. Because if we want kids who can think, feel, and handle life, we've got to start building their mental muscles the old school way. One challenge, one decision, one unplugged moment at a time. So let me ask you this. What would happen if you gave your kids just a taste of that old school freedom? What if the next generation had both the tools of today and the toughness of the past? If this made you think, even just a little, don't keep it to yourself. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, and let's open this conversation up. And hey, if you want more content like this, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. We've only scratched the surface, and there's a whole world of hidden psychology left to explore.